was talking about disruptors and the fact that you don't have to be in technology to be a disruptor, as we can see from the names Ford, McDonald's, Aldi, Lidl, and Brewdog. You may ask, well, how were they innovators? How were they disruptors? Ford, because they were the first manufacturer to put in place a moving conveyor belt for manufacture, which enabled them to improve the output beyond anybody's imagination and absolutely corner the market in the cars. McDonald's, for their unique marketing and franchising program that they introduced, and as we now know is known throughout the world. Aldi and Lidl, because they're challenging the majors in their world by a different approach to the market. And Brewdog as well. I don't know if you know about Brewdog, but it's a brewery. It makes beer, but it's changed the market completely by the way that it markets its products, by giving it funny names like Punk IPA and changing the labeling to move away from the old traditional way of selling beers. In fact, you can see its influence has worked through to the wine market now, and lots of if you go into the supermarket and have a look at the names and the labeling on the wine, you'll see that often they've got kind of modernish names, which for me make me feel uncomfortable, but they seem to work with the younger generation. They seem to be selling very well. So it's not all about technology, and I'm going to come back to this point about innovation and disrupting later on. So here we are in the middle of this pandemic with this thing called new normal, which has in effect created a huge disruption in the marketplace. And as a consequence of that, there have been some amazing winners from the disruption, which we all know about: e-commerce, video conferencing, home entertainment technology generally. But at the same time, there have been some dreadful losers, particularly the travel industry, hospitality, retail, physical retail, and that's knocked on to the landlords who are suffering very badly with their ability to collect rents. Some of the biggest landlords in London are reporting their results for the quarter of 29th September closed. And whilst they were doing well on office rents, they were only, one of them in particular, one of the largest ones, reported only collected 50% of the rent on its physical retail shops. And when you think that the number that it would normally collect, 50% of that is a large sum to be short of. And that knocks straight onto the pension funds, who actually are the people who often invest in them, and therefore will be the pensioners who suffer from the lack of funds available to pay their pensions. Manufacturing, of course, automobiles at the top of that, but anybody with the supply chain is really, really suffering and having difficulties as a consequence of the knock-on effect of the shutdown, lack of availability of normal workforce, people not being able to work at all in manufacturing facilities sometimes, and also then the transport getting in a mess, and the logistical chain just falling apart. So lots and lots and lots of problems. Here's the thing, as Joe Biden would say, I don't know if you picked this up, but in his debates with Mr. Trump, he kept on saying, and here's the thing. And I think it's quite a good way of emphasizing what he wants to say. So here we go, I'm having a go at it. This is what's so different. In all these problems which are coming up, which are turning towards disputes, nobody's at fault. The retailer who's unable to pay their rent isn't choosing to be unable to pay the rent. They're unable to pay the rent because the footfall past their door has completely collapsed. They just are not getting the volume of customers into their premises in order to sell to them. And some of the retail properties, I mean, if you take, for example, one which is based in a tube station, you know, sometimes you come up through the tube and you come out into a retail space before you get to the outdoors. Well, normally got a ridiculous number of people passing their door every day. And right now, they've got just a fraction. So their business is suffering. They don't choose not to pay their rent. They just can't do it. And the same is happening throughout commerce. Markets which were there have completely collapsed. In the airline market, they're just completely devastated by the decimated. Sorry, is what I was looking for. By the lack of passengers wanting to travel. And the other thing which is important here, and why I think these are novel problems, are that not only is no one at fault, both parties are experiencing similar difficulties on the other end of different contracts. So on the one hand, where a supplier has problem with a supplier delivering them goods, they're probably also having problems with their customer in terms of their customer meeting their contractual obligations. So everybody is in a big commercial mess. And this is the last thing in this slide. Default-based dispute resolution mechanisms really are not suitable for trying to sort out these types of problems. So right now, many remedies also are no longer available. So, for example, if you're a landlord, you can't evict your tenants at the moment. If you're a creditor, you can't threaten to wind up your debtor for failing to pay their debts. And so it is in many respects that the remedies that used to be available just are not there. And that's been done deliberately to try to avoid there being a mass of litigation. I'm sure you're all well aware of this Cabinet Office guidance, which was issued back in May. But this very much reflects what I'm trying to say here about the fact that the disputes which are being thrown up now are new and they're different. And the existing normal ways of resolving disputes just are not suitable. It's very interesting to read this note and to identify what the government was trying to do. And essentially, the way I have characterized it is that they were saying to the commercial world, be kind to one another. Don't rely on your contractual rights to enforce contractual obligations that the other party just can no longer meet. Instead, preserve your relationship. And that's a really, really key aspect of this. Where continued contractual performance is not possible or is not essential, ensuring those contracts, supply chains and markets can be preserved during the public health emergency is critically important. So that's what the government was saying to us. CEDA and the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators did respond to this and produced what they called the Pandemic Business Dispute Resolution Service. And it's a combined offering where CEDA offer a facilitated contract negotiation. I'll look at that in a little bit more in a moment. And the Chartered Institute offered its one of its expedited arbitration rules to resolve these types of disputes very quickly. I have to say, the expedited arbitration is old school dispute resolution. It's not what the government's looking for in terms of preserving relationships. The CEDA end of that, the facilitated contract negotiation, is much more what the government is looking for, and in the context of my discussion is a novel solution to the problem. Now, I say novel solution, CEDA have been offering this for a number of years, and if you look on their website, you'll find reference to facilitated contract negotiations and a number of examples of illustrations where one of their panel have been appointed to do just that. So it's not new in terms of it being dreamt up now. It's been around for a while, but it hasn't been, I don't think, very widely used, and it's not widely known about, I don't think, in the commercial world. Certainly when I talk about it, people are not familiar with it and not come across it before. I'd be interested to hear your experiences. Personally, as a partner in a law firm before I retired and started working as a full-time mediator, I actually took 3 of my own cases through a facilitated negotiation because of the particular circumstances. Of course, this was years before we got anywhere near this pandemic, not in the context of that at all, but it was a situation where the parties wanted to preserve their contractual relationship. And I decided that I would take them through facilitation rather than a mediation. And I'll come on to explain what I see as the differences between those two in a short while. Let me just continue with the, just looking at what CEDA say that they offer with their facilitated contract negotiation. Oh, sorry. They say a neutral will work with the parties to find a mutually acceptable modification in a contractual relationship where a negotiation needs assistance or has stalled. The process will be conducted online in as swift a manner as possible, as mutually agreed with the parties. So that's a very specific online offering. There's another offering which is new and which is being launched later this week by the London Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And they have got a completely new set of rules for what they call facilitated contract renegotiation. And there is a protocol which has been written to guide the parties as to what to expect, to help the facilitator work out how to conduct the facilitation, and generally set out the legal framework within which the facilitation will take place. Now, I happen to know about this because I did the first draft of the rules and the protocol. It's been through the committee and gone up to the board and been approved, and will be launched later this week. But it's a very similar offering to CEDA's, frankly. It's not online like CEDA's. It's proposing a much more considered approach in terms of preparation and conducting preliminary meetings between the parties and the facilitator. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a second. So those are the 2 offerings that I'm aware of in the marketplace. I know that other institutions are looking at it and considering introducing their own rules. But at the moment, these are the 2 which are prevalent in the London market, UK market. So now this is really important. Because people do get confused between facilitation and mediation. Facilitation is very different. It is a situation where the parties work together. Okay, the mediation parties kind of work together, but actually working against each other to achieve a common goal. Well, you may say in mediation they're trying to achieve a common goal, which is the settlement of the dispute. But this common goal is maintaining their relationship, not ending their relationship. Now, notwithstanding that in mediation school, they teach you about win-win situations, such as the fight over the oranges. I don't know if any of you remember this. there's three companies fighting over a harvest of oranges, and it can be used as a role play. It turns out that if they'd only spoken to each other, they'd find out that they weren't competing with the same part of the oranges. One wants the orange juice for orange juice, one wants the rind for marmalade, and the other wants the pith for some pharmaceutical product. So there's a beautiful win-win solution to it all. But in most of the commercial mediations I do, the prospect of the parties burying the hatchet, ending their argument and shaking hands and continuing to do business together is just never going to happen. In all mediations that I've done, it happened a couple of times, but it's very, very rare. Whereas with a facilitation, the parties have come to this process specifically because they want to maintain the contract. That is their objective, and it's a shared objective. And this is really important too. They recognize and accept the contract must change. Now, the contract reflects their kind of opening positions. That's been hammered out and worked out and spelt out in terms. That is what the parties' rights are between each other. But they're not fighting over what the contract says, who has the benefit of this clause, who has the liability as a consequence of this clause. On the contrary, they're accepting that these clauses have got to change, and they're trying to find a new way to construct their relationship so they can continue in business. So it requires a very, very different mindset. And it is not about who's right and who's wrong. It's about how are we going to work together in the future. I just wanted to draw this to your attention. I wanted to make a point out of this. So this is a statement which is on CEDA's website about the facilitation process in the context of the contract facilitation service that they're offering. And as a statement, it's perfectly fine, and I agree with it entirely. At the heart of a mediator's skill set is the ability to manage a process to enable dialogue and facilitate negotiation. Of course, absolutely 100% right. As mediators, we use our skills to facilitate negotiations all the time. And because of this, the language which is used there, which is used throughout the mediation world, we get a talk about a mediator mediating and a mediator facilitating. And therefore, there is a tendency for people in this field, particularly lawyers, to think as facilitation as just being part of mediation, and that a mediation agreement is perfectly fine to enter into between the parties who intend to facilitate a renegotiation of the contract. And in my opinion, that's quite dangerous and quite wrong, because facilitation is a different process. It really is, and it needs to be seen and practiced as a different process. The problem is, if you just use mediation and call it a mediation, then people who are familiar with mediation will approach it as they approach a mediation. They need to approach it with a different mindset. They need to approach it with this common goal, and without relying on positions and who's right and who's wrong. And I therefore think it's important to make this big distinction between facilitation and mediation. So I've said this before, facilitation, it's not about who's right and who's wrong. Parties agree to move away from their old positions. They look to refresh their relationship. And the facilitator has a different role to that of a mediator. And this is a statement from the London Chamber of Commerce's protocol on facilitated contract renegotiation. How does FCR, facilitated contract renegotiation, differ from mediation? Mediation, like arbitration and litigation, starts with an allocation of fault and usually seeks a solution that assumes the party's business relationship has ended. In contrast, facilitation does not ascribe fault and seeks a solution based on the premise that parties want to continue their business relationship. So with that at the core of the process, how does the facilitator conduct themselves, and how different is it from a mediation? So the way we've encapsulated this in the protocol is to say there is no fixed process for the conduct of facilitation. The process will be determined by the facilitator according to the particular requirements of the matter. And on being appointed, the facilitator will, first thing they will do is contact the parties separately to discuss the issues and the most suitable process to be adopted in the particular case. And then the facilitator will advise the parties what is the process to be adopted, and will then be responsible for seeing that process through. And the key aspect of the facilitator's role is to maintain the level of trust that's necessary to exist between the parties to come up with a new solution. Now, in a negotiation, in a mediation, trust is at an all-time low at the start of the mediation. The parties come in with their respective positions and their demands. And even though they may intend to negotiate, they still don't trust the other party. And that's why sometimes mediations can be so slow and so painful. Whilst one party makes an offer, the other party tries to tear it to shreds and understand what it signifies and read all sorts of runes into what they're seeing in front of them. And they have this huge level of distrust about what the other party is doing. In a facilitation, the parties are coming together with the objective of trying to find a solution to work together. So they are going to have a trusting relationship for the future. And so the facilitator's job is to identify and emphasize that trust in a discreet way, but consistently with that in mind, and mindful of any movement, any statement, anything that may start an element of mistrust creeping in, to make sure that it's addressed immediately, because that is the source of an old-time dispute, which is where the parties have agreed not to go, where the facilitator therefore is the guardian of the process to make sure they don't fall into that crack. So I hope that illustrates to you why I consider that it is such a fundamentally different process. So I've spoken enough. I'm sure you've got loads of questions. I hope you've got loads of questions. In summary, novel disputes require novel solutions, and facilitated contract negotiation or renegotiation is a new solution. It is different. There are loads of companies out there who are really struggling at the moment, who are putting sticky plasters on all of their contracts all over the place, and sometimes not addressing them fully, just hoping that things will turn out all right. But they're going to have difficult conversations at some point to get that relationship back on track. And the sooner they start doing that, the better. And this is a process which can be used to do that. And I think that, just as I was illustrating earlier, that there is an opportunity where disruption occurs for innovation. I believe that the disruption caused in business creates an opportunity for there to be a new form of solution for business problems. And although this protocol and the London Chamber of Commerce's rules are clearly designed to deal with problems which arise out of the pandemic, I do believe that the principles are perfectly adaptable and indeed entirely suitable for use in all aspects of commerce once we've got through this pandemic. And I genuinely believe if companies, when they first get the inkling of that feeling of distrust of their counterparty, which eventually will deteriorate into a dispute in the, as I call in the old-fashioned way, if they would only grapple with that properly and thoroughly when that emerges, then they could avoid a huge number of disputes. And they can do that through the facilitation process if they're not able to do it party to party. So that's what I have to say, and I'm delighted to take any questions.